All right. So, on behalf of the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies and the Labor Solidarity Project at the University of Washington, Tacoma, I'd like to welcome everybody back to this first installment of our fall seminar series, which we're calling Educate, Agitate, and Organize. So, I'm Alex Miller, and I'm an associate teaching professor here at UW-T. I teach labor studies, American studies, and literature. And I got to say, it's great to be back. It's great to see all these people in the room. Get some familiar names on the list, but also some names that are new to us. It's always an honor for me to be able to share this new and important work in the field of labor studies. And we have a diverse audience of students, local activists, laborites from across the country, and we do have, I think, I'm about as biased as they come on the topic, but a pretty fantastic lineup of events this fall. We've got academics, we've got activists whose work I think really reflects, a real dedication to that like ongoing fight for racial and economic justice. And we're kicking things off this academic year with what I think is just an outstanding event that could not be more timely. This is going to be a talk that covers what's something it's a small, but it's a growing subsection of the contemporary labor marketplace. And it's work that, for many of us, hits really close to home. And I'm talking about the precarious work of the gig economy. This is a segment of the working world it's comparatively young, right? But it's like rapidly evolving. And it's composed almost exclusively at this point of non-unionized workers who are, struggling to be seen, heard, and understood. And I think, it'll probably come as no surprise to anyone on this call that in pursuit of profit, many of the companies that we typically associate with this kind of work, the Ubers of the world, the DoorDashes, the TaskRabbits, they've increasingly placed their bottom line and, of course, shareholder returns over their commitment to their employees, right? And those employees exist in this kind of like weird liminal state, right? They're independent contractors, maybe they're partners. These are the people who actually do the work, right? Especially during the last couple of years over the course of the pandemic. And I think like that field of work itself, our understanding of that kind of work's also evolving, which is why I'm really excited to introduce our guest who, in my opinion, I don't know that there are many people out there who've spent more time kind of studying the evolution of this type of work, but also spending time with the workers and exploring like the lived experience of navigating, both the gig and the sharing economy than our guest tonight. And so speaking of our guest tonight, please welcome Dr. Alexandrea Ravenelle, who's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and is also a 2023-24 Russel Sage Foundation visiting scholar. She's the author of the excellent Hustle and Gig, Struggling and Surviving in the Sharing Economy, which came out in 2019. And coming out later this month, I'm really excited about this. This is like the beginning of the book tour later this month from California Press, Side Hustle Safety Net: How Vulnerable Workers Survive Precarious Times. So this is kind of a book launch, which I think I'd have to go back and check my records, but this might be a labor solidarity project first, which is really exciting. And I think, the work itself is really exciting. So I am excited to share your work with our campus and community. Just really appreciate the insight and the expertise that you bring here. And so I think what we're going to do, we spoke ahead of time, we'll have kind of our typical, presentation followed by Q&A. So if you have questions, go ahead and add them to the chat board. We'll kind of cycle back through those after the presentation. And we've also had some questions submitted ahead of time by students in my class. So plenty to talk about. And with that said, I'm going to hand it over to our guests.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Alex. That was like the best intro I've ever gotten. I think I would like you to come to more book events with me. That's fantastic. So this is my first book talk for this new book, Side Hustle Safety Net. So bear with me. It's been a little while since I wrote this thing, so I had to go back over and like, what did I write? So first and foremost, I have some acknowledgments. This project was funded with an NSF Rapid grant, and I've been lucky to work with a great team of both grad and undergrad students over at UNC. Now, I like to tell the stories of these workers. I think that is really my job and my obligation. So I'm going to open up here with the tale of two workers. And I just want to give a little disclaimer. There are pictures here, but these are not the workers. These are stock photos to represent roughly their race, ethnicity, age, and sex. So Abdul was a 27-year-old Middle Eastern American who was working several jobs, restaurant and bar server, videographer, and doing light catering on the side. But when COVID hit, he lost all of his work. He tried applying for unemployment assistance, but he was a tipped worker in New York, and he hadn't been working there long enough or making enough to qualify for New York's unemployment. He tried applying for unemployment in Florida, where he'd been living previously, and he was told he didn't qualify because he'd left the state. When we interviewed him for the first time in May 2020, he was unemployed and described himself as super anxious all the time. He'd run out of money, he'd turned to gig work, but he soon discovered that that gig work wasn't dependable either. One of the food delivery platforms that he was approved for only allowed workers to sign up for 30 minutes at a time, and there was no guarantee that there'd be any work during those shifts. Frustrated, he ends up turning to Craigslist and moving gigs, other work that he also describes as horrible. Instead of being direct hires by the resident, most of the positions were being posted by outsourcing middlemen, people who bid on moving gigs and rented a U-Haul and hired people via Craigslist. When items were broken, the price of those items came out of his cash payment. One time a worker threw a bench that had picture frames in it. They all broke. He had to pay for it. Another time, another worker leaned on a statue that also broke. Sometimes he worked for hours and wasn't paid at all. He tried looking for a more stable W-2 paced job, even walking his neighborhood with a stack of applications to no avail. One job he applied for, he didn't hear back for a full year. It took them that long to go through all the applications ahead of his. Even so, even though he wasn't always getting paid, it was still better than the gig-based food delivery they described as not a steady income, something you couldn't count on. You were never certain if you were going to be able to make rent. You were just trying to make enough money to survive. And even if you weren't earning the money, you were just simply borrowing it from your future self. So what about Andrew? Andrew was also 27. He had just finished a stint in the Peace Corps in 2019, and then he spent several months as an au pair while he decided what he wanted to do. In early 2020, he decided to follow his dream of working in a high-end restaurant. It took a month, but eventually he convinced one such restaurant in New York to let him trail, which is essentially auditioning for work. 4 days in, on Thursday of that week, he was officially hired. And then on day 5, that Friday, the chef walks into the office and announces that they're closing due to COVID. Now, he hadn't been working there for at least 90 days, but because he was, quote, on the books, and he had lost his job through a corona-related event, he was able to qualify for unemployment assistance. It didn't hurt either that the CEO of the restaurant group that he was working for pledged to pay the workers for an additional week after the restaurant closed and later started an employee relief fund. Also, Andrew was a minimum wage worker, not a tipped worker. In his week on the books at the restaurant, he had earned minimum wage for 35 hours, or about $500. Okay? When I interviewed Andrew for the first time in early June 2020, he was still receiving partial unemployment of almost $900 a week and had taken a part-time job as a cheesemonger at a local farmer's market. He was also helping friends with a small food startup. He noted that by April, the second month of the pandemic, he was making more than he had been making previously, pre-COVID, and he was able to establish a nest egg and even put down a deposit on an apartment. As he put it, I feel kind of safe that I'll definitely be able to pay rent in the future. Now, interviewed for a second time, again, in early 2021, both men were in very different places. Abdul was still piecing together an income through 2 part-time restaurant jobs. He was working in a cafeteria in the mornings from Monday through Thursday and then again on Saturdays, and then he worked in a hookah lounge on Friday through Sunday. Andrew, meanwhile, had accepted a full-time job at the startup, which offered a salary, benefits, and a clear career trajectory. Now, both Andrew and Abdul lost jobs during the coronavirus pandemic. Well, Andrew was officially unemployed and qualified for unemployment benefits, including the additional $600 a week of FPUC. Abdul was part of the forgotten jobless. Left to fend for himself, Abdul turned to the side hustle safety net of gig work. And while his vow to make it through is admirable, the inequity between their situations is jarring. Now, to be fair, there was inequity in their situations before the pandemic. Andrew is white, Abdul is Middle Eastern American. Andrew has a college degree and a middle-class background. Abdul had to leave college due to debt and is more working class. But they both entered the pandemic while working in restaurants, which Abdul had more experience in anyway. And yet, Abdul was a tipped worker who didn't qualify for unemployment, and Andrew, as a minimum wage worker, did. Side Hustle Safety Net is the story of what happens to these most precarious workers, the gig workers and laid off restaurant staff, the early career creatives, and the minimum wage employees when the economy suddenly collapses, and how they fare in the pursuit of an economic recovery. Now, before I jump any further into the research, I want to give you a little bit of background on unemployment. I am not a historian, so I promise I will try to make this part as short as possible. So a lot of us realize that unemployment comes out of the Great Depression, but we don't always realize when it comes out. The Great Depression starts in 1929, and it's not until 1935 that we actually create an unemployment insurance program in the US, and we don't even implement it until 1937. Now, there were earlier efforts to create unemployment benefits, which were often done by textile unions. But in general, when people lost jobs, they relied on their savings or had family and friends or religious institutions to help them out. During the Great Depression, when unemployment was estimated to hit 25%, local charities quickly became overwhelmed with need. If you read any of Howard Zinn's work, he talks about people literally starving in the streets. Even during the Depression, the focus was less on getting money to individuals out of fear of a dole and government dependency, and more on the idea of propping up industries and creating jobs. When unemployment insurance was finally created, it was essentially limited to middle and upper class white men working for established firms. As time goes on, more occupations begin to qualify for unemployment, including farm workers and state employees. Now, early materials created by the Social Security Office in the 1930s tried to explain unemployment assistance to the population by noting that unemployment was expensive, but it was expensive for the communities. It was expensive for the workers, for the government, and for society at large. And the whole point of unemployment insurance, which companies had to contribute to, was to more equitably distribute those costs. Now, we bumped a bit. Now, unemployment assistance is an automatic stabilizer. It helps unemployed workers maintain some of their purchasing power and prevents a more severe economic downturn. The Center for American Progress describes it as providing the biggest bang for the buck of the various kinds of government spending, noting that during the Great Recession, every dollar spent on unemployment benefits grew the economy by $2, since recipients typically spend instead of saving those dollars. Now, in today's talk, I'm going to be talking mostly about these officially unemployed workers, the ones who qualify for and receive unemployment benefits, as opposed to these forgotten jobless workers who are left to fend for themselves. And part of the reason is because as time has gone on, these groups have actually become more like each other than you would expect. During the Great Recession, when unemployment assistance reached a max of 99 weeks, leading rise to the title of 99ers, numerous states borrowed from the federal government in order to sustain their unemployment benefits. For too long, they had simply let companies contribute too little to their funds, and so now they needed the loans. Now, these federal government loans came with interest, and in 2012, the federal government triggered an increase in the amount that each state's employers had to pay into the state unemployment trust fund. Some states, like Rhode Island, temporarily raised the amount of taxes that employers paid in. Other states slowly paid off the debt without making changes or added programs that expanded eligibility or supported short-term compensation for things like work sharing. Other states, like North Carolina, where I teach, slashed benefit levels and the maximum number of weeks of benefits, and also linked benefits to the local unemployment rate. As a result, being unemployed in the US doesn't always mean getting benefits. Workers who are not at a job long enough or who didn't make enough during their work quarters, those who have part-time jobs or side hustles that keep them working, even if they're not actually earning very much money, can all be disqualified from unemployment. Abdul is an example of a worker who does not qualify and is forced to turn to side hustle safety net of gig work. And these benefits are going to vary by state and vary a lot. And they're not going to vary just in terms of amount, but also in how long they last. In North Carolina and Florida, unemployed workers only get 12 weeks of benefits. And that's if you can even get those benefits. Many states make it incredibly difficult to apply or receive the funds. Washington State has very nice benefits. You should all be very thrilled for that, ranging from $323 to over $1,000 a week for 13 to 26 weeks, and will even allow workers to do some earning of additional money before those benefits are affected or reduced. Additionally, unemployment benefits are not linked to inflation. So as time goes on, unless there's a conscious effort to increase them by a state, they simply shrink. And 1099 workers, independent contractors, don't qualify either, which is a problem because workers are increasingly being miscategorized as independent contractors. So we have all this background about the unemployment system, and then we have the CARES Act. And CARES Act unemployment programs are often described in terms of their novelty, unprecedented, unparalleled, unheard of, but they just as easily could have been described as revolutionary. So in March 2020, we have the CARES Act. I promise this is the last bit of history. We have the CARES Act. This gives us the federal pandemic unemployment compensation. This is the additional $600 a week that unemployed workers get from April and through the end of July 2020. Now, how did we end up with $600? Well, unemployment insurance, because it hasn't kept up with inflation, instead of replacing 50% of what workers were making, now it's replacing closer to 35 or even 40%. So median wage is $1,000 a week. People are getting $400 a week. Oh, we got to give them $600, make sure they're at an even keel during the pandemic. So this, of course, ended up being a little bit of an overshoot in some states, and approximately 76% of US workers end up receiving income that exceeds their lost wages between April and July 2020. Now, later on, when we go to the $300 a week enhanced unemployment assistance beginning in December 2020, these numbers get much closer to what workers have been making previously. Now, this is also revolutionary because independent contractors, gig workers, freelancers, all those 1099 workers do not usually qualify for unemployment assistance. The only reason they're included in this CARES Act is because it has broader language that allows anyone, regardless of employment type, to receive benefits if they can prove that their work was impacted by the pandemic. Even so, these workers only get about half of the benefits of their W-2 peers. So in New York, the maximum unemployment, $504 for W-2 workers, and the gig workers, 1099 workers, are going to get a max of $252 in addition to that $600. So my research, my work in the time of COVID project, which led to the Side Hustle Safety Net, asks, how does obtaining the status of being officially unemployed or being part of the forgotten job list affect workers? What does it mean to these gig-based and precarious workers to receive these funds? And what is the impact, both immediate and longer term, on these workers? How do these larger social trends, such as the internalization of risk and the rise of polyemployment or working 2 or more jobs, affect precarious workers during these unsettled times? So this project also benefited from the CARES Act because it funded the NSF Rapid program, which made the project possible. It is based on interviews conducted with 199 gig-based and precarious workers that were about 95% 5% of them were done between April 2020 and June 2020. We did interview a handful of Airbnb hosts in August. We need that delay in order to find out how Airbnb was going to handle sort of payments and if there was going to be any handling of payments. We did so this is a panel study. So we have this group of 199 and we are following them through time. We did a second round of phone interviews with these same workers beginning in November of 2020. And we're at about a 15% attrition rate, so 168 workers. And then I actually just finished a third round of interviews with these workers this past spring, and a fourth round will start later this fall. So it's a lot of interviews. I just got an error message. Can you still see me?
I can still see you. We can't see the PowerPoint.
What just happened? Okay, now can you?
Yep, you're back on.
Okay, good. Okay, sorry about that. So our workers, these 199 workers, 60 of them are platform-based: Uber, TaskRabbit, Rover, DoorDash, Instacart. Then we have 15 workers that we call non-platform gig workers. These are going to include individuals who get work via Craigslist. It's also going to include this new movement in the gig economy that I call shadow gig platforms. And I'm happy to talk more about those in the Q&A because these shadow gig platforms, I think, are especially scary. Like, they make some of like the Uber and TaskRabbit stuff look tame by comparison. We also have 60 creative freelancers. These were individuals who are often both W-2 and 1099 workers. They were usually working in person before the pandemic. So they were musicians, dancers, models, actors, extras. Then we also have 31 non-medical low-wage workers. These are retail workers, grocery store workers, individuals working in personal care, nails, massage, babysitters, drugstore workers, a little bit of everyone, and then restaurant workers, 33 of those. And the reason why we have these three groups is we wanted to really tease out the impact of being in this pandemic as either a 1099 worker or a W-2 worker. So one of the criticisms of Hustle and Gig was, well, of course, all these workers aren't doing well. They're low-wage workers. Like, no one expects a taxi driver to be like living the high life. But on this project, we wanted to have both these W-2 workers who are working for restaurants and who are doing this retail work, and also these sort of often more educated 1099 workers who are the creative freelancers, in addition to the gig workers. So we end up with these three big groups. You can see between phase 1 and phase 2, we have a little bit of attrition, but every group is still roughly represented at the same proportions. We don't have any massive fall off in any of the levels. Recruitment for a project of this size is pretty intense. We used Facebook groups, we posted on Craigslist, online job boards, including Offstage Jobs and Dance NYC. In New York and probably in other places, it was very difficult for people to get in touch with the unemployment office. So there was an actual Facebook group called like Unemployed New Yorkers Who Can't Get Help. And so we posted on there. For the Craigslist, we posted in both gig jobs and jobs that were part-time by various industries. And we recruited one worker from in person. He was actually busking in a local park, and then also snowball sampling, where we asked people at the end of an interview if they knew anybody else that they would recommend. We use an interview matrix, which allows for a respondent-driven interview. So the interview matrix is the same thing I used in Hustle and Gig. We have what looks like a bingo board, questions in each one, and we go through, and it allows us to jump around a lot. So to whatever type of topic the respondent wants to talk about next. And then we use index coding, because jumping around on interviews means that your transcripts are kind of a mess. The interviews just keep getting longer. First round, they just averaged under an hour and a half. Second round, we're up to 109 minutes. On this third round of interviews, we are over 2 hours on average per interview, with some exceeding 4. Um, Demographics for our respondents, roughly equally split between men and women, slightly larger percentage of women, 2% who identified as non-gender conforming, transgender, or non-binary. The majority of our sample is white, about 41%. We've roughly equal percentages of individuals who identify as Black, Hispanic, Asian, or multiracial. Our respondents are pretty well educated. 37% have a bachelor's degree. That's roughly equal to the levels in New York in general. 20% have a graduate degree. Only 9% had high school degree or less. So I want to jump in now to these findings, and to start off by talking about who exactly these forgotten jobless are, because in some cases our findings here were a little surprising. So the forgotten jobless fall into three main categories. Either they didn't know about unemployment assistance, they didn't want unemployment assistance, which seems hard to believe, but is a real thing, or they simply couldn't wait for unemployment assistance. So in terms of workers not knowing about it, these were individuals who did not know that they were eligible for unemployment or did not know how to apply. Scott, for instance, didn't apply for any unemployment because he hadn't had full-time work in about 3 years. He'd been working part-time jobs. But unemployment is open to part-time workers as long as they've worked a sufficient number of quarters and they've made a sufficient amount of money. Workers also didn't know that they qualified because they were immigrants. In many cases, they believed that if they applied for unemployment assistance, that they would be deported by then President Trump. And it wasn't actually clear with immigration if applying for unemployment assistance could result in deportation. It actually remained sort of a gray area. In some cases, workers didn't want unemployment assistance because they perceived it as stigmatized. Dayani, who's an unemployed TaskRabbit worker and dog walker, had this really memorable quote of talking about how she didn't believe in free rides. She believed in hard work. And so instead of applying for unemployment assistance, she started rationing out her food. She would only eat one meal a day that she would get from the local soup pantry, and she attempted to fill herself up by drinking lots of water. Likewise, Mateo, a private investigator who then turned to food delivery work, talked about how unemployment wasn't for people like him. It wasn't for people who work, which is, in one hand, true. If you are currently working, it's very difficult to get unemployment assistance. But also, unemployment is one of those things you can only get if you have worked, if you've worked a certain level of hours and made a certain amount of money. And in some cases, unemployment took so long for workers to get that they ended up being pushed into gig-based work. Amir was an unemployed small business owner. He had a entertainment-focused small business that had to close with the pandemic. He had to return deposits for his business engagements and had no money. And so he ends up turning to doing food delivery. He's applied for unemployment assistance. It is MIA, in his words, missing in action. And so he's driving around seeing the large white refrigerator trucks that were all over New York at that time and being honestly worried about what's going to happen to him and fearing for his own life, but feeling that he has no other options. So we have these forgotten jobless who are, they believe, risking their lives by doing delivery. And to be fair, at this point in the pandemic, workers who, a great deciding factor about whether you're going to get COVID is whether you're able to shelter at home or whether you are forced to be out working. And so for these officially unemployed workers, these are the people who get the fullest level of benefits, which in New York is going to be about $1,100 a week. This unemployment assistance is life transforming. These funds provide them with an opportunity to rest, reflect, and reset their careers. They return to school, they start businesses, and change careers, and even leave gig work behind. For instance, Caitlin, a 24-year-old who had 8 years of experience as a server and bartender, ends up leaving bartending, taking the unemployment, taking some time to think about what she wants to do, then she decides to become a dental assistant and then go back to school so she can become a dental hygienist. She had been often yelled at the bar, told that she was an idiot, cursed at repeatedly. And she says, I never thought I was good enough to work a 9 to 5 job. And now I'm contributing to society instead of contributing to the delinquency of society. Likewise, Beverly, who's 59, who was unemployed from her job as a part-time retail stylist, also went back to school and became an addiction counselor. And she says, it's not like chasing Chanel or Louis Vuitton, but I'd rather replace my luxury way of thinking for internal beauty and helping people. Tyson was 28 and college educated, but he had been driving for Uber for 4 years, much longer than he had ever thought he would. In many of the interviews with workers that I've done who've been in the gig economy for years, they often talk at first about, oh, it's just a short-term thing. I'm only going to do it for a little while. It's just to like make ends meet. And in many cases, they end up stuck, like Tyson. Tyson applied for unemployment assistance. He didn't want to be driving. There wasn't very much demand at that point, but he faced extensive delays in getting his unemployment assistance. And when it finally arrived, it was a windfall of $8,000. He opens up his bank account. He sees the amount of money. He's never had that much money in his bank account before. He feels all these different things. He talks about crying at the time, feeling shock, and then also feeling this sense that he now has an opportunity to make something different in his life happen. He's been trying for so long to make money doing Uber. He has a car rental payment, all these things. And he ends up turning in his license for Uber and becoming a community rehabilitation specialist, providing support to individuals with developmental disabilities. Now, there are so many of these stories. With 199 respondents, we have so many of every story. But the most extreme of these is probably Cody, who is 30 years old. He was doing some dog walking and also working as a planner before the pandemic. Now, Cody had been laid off at one point in his late 20s. And at that point, he was very worried about finding a new job. As he says, it was definitely, okay, I need to figure this out immediately. Like, I very strongly need to get right back into the job market. He gets laid off for the second time in his life at age 30 during the COVID pandemic. Now he's got plenty of unemployment assistance coming in. And he's like, I don't want to dive into a stressful situation. I want to take this. I want to think about what I want. I don't want to be working 80 hours a week unless it's something I really love. And I haven't found anything like that. He takes some time to think. He also takes time to think about putting together a business plan. And in fall of 2021, he launches a dog boarding business with 5 employees that's making $20,000 a month. By far the biggest success story out of all of these officially unemployed workers. I know Alex is like, I thought it was going to be all just depressing stuff like my usual work. No, there are some actually happy stories. But I wouldn't be a good sociologist if I didn't point out all the unhappy stories too. So, not all of these officially unemployed workers are going to benefit equally. Workers who do not have stable housing, or those who are brand new to their careers, for instance, new college grads who don't necessarily have large networks of work contacts, or workers who experience long COVID or other health situations for either themselves or their families, they're not going to benefit in the same way. Now, given the size of the pandemic and the disruptions, one could argue that simply maintaining the status quo or even simply keeping your head above water in this type of situation is on its own an accomplishment. But I mention this because I don't want you to think that the money is magic. Okay? It can help create career transformations and huge ones. But sometimes it also just allows workers to maintain instead of struggling even more in the face of these difficulties. Now, many of these workers who were struggling were creative freelancers who were involved in live performance before the pandemic. And they often reported that their lives and their careers were on hold. For these workers, the money allows them to simply maintain their expenses until things improve. For instance, Kelsey, who's a 28-year-old unemployed dancer with numerous family members affected by long COVID, talks about how she's pretty much on like a hiatus because of what the pandemic has brought up for her in her life. Gabriel, who was 22, was a dance unicorn. And fortunately, one of the grad students on my team was very familiar with dance, and she explained this to me. He had just finished a very prestigious undergrad dance program and had immediately been hired to be a dancer with a company, which apparently is absolutely unheard of. By way of comparison, of his graduating class of like 20 other dancers, only like 2 others ended up with jobs at all that were related to dance. And so this was very much like he had it made. But his company, of course, closes because of the pandemic, and then it ends up being disbanded. And Gabriel is looking for additional work. At one point, he starts applying for grocery stores, thinking that he has found the perfect solution, right? You always need food. You work for the grocery store, you can get a worker discount, it'll be great. And he ends up quite hurt because every single grocery store he applies to during a supposed labor shortage rejects him. They're like, no, you're overqualified. We're not even going to hire you. And he's very upset that he's never heard of anyone getting rejected for grocery stores, but he does. Eventually, he ends up doing phone-based customer service work and sort of practicing his plies in between calls. Another worker who ends up very much being affected by the pandemic and in sort of a holding pattern is Zev, who's also 30. He was an unemployed Airbnb host, a musician, and an immigrant. An alien of extraordinary ability is the phrase. He was in the US on an artistic visa. Now, when you are in the US on an artistic visa, you have to show that you are really, you have extraordinary ability, and you're highlighting this through publicity that you get for your performances and for your work. And so he decided to take his unemployment assistance and use it to buy a school bus that he was transforming into a live workspace and a stage on wheels. And then he was going to drive that stage around the country so that he would get additional attention for his movement, and he would be able to guarantee that he'd be able to keep performing, keep dancing, and get additional attention. Now, while the officially unemployed workers are generally better off than the forgotten jobless, it's also important to note that workers who engaged in polyemployment before or during the pandemic also face an increased level of vulnerability. Now, unemployment assistance is structured under the premise of one worker, one job. And yet, in our economy, we're seeing an increasing number of workers who are engaged in gig work. According to Pew, we're up to about 16%, and that might actually be a drop based on how they measure it. Or we're also seeing an increase in workers who are engaged in multiple job holding, what I call polyemployment. And federal studies are suggesting it's about 8%. Now, even this 8%, though, is probably an underestimate because it's only based on the idea that somebody has a stable full-time W-2 job and then has a second part-time W-2 job. It doesn't take into account people where all of their work is for multiple employers, or their primary job is not W-2 or not long-term and stable. Now, there are multiple reasons for this increase in polyemployment and in gig work. Underemployment, wage stagnation, the fact that creative work is increasingly classified as freelance work or 1099 work. And also that individuals have been urged to pursue their passions. And oftentimes pursuing your passion means having one job that pays the bills, hopefully, and another job that might be your actual passion. Now, polyemployment can decrease unemployment benefits or even disqualify workers entirely. The idea is that if somebody still has a job, then unemployment will say, well, you're still working, you're still making money, you don't get any unemployment benefits. And especially early on, if you were working for even a single minute in New York, they would decrease your unemployment benefits by 25%, with the idea that if you were working for 1 minute, you were working that day, and therefore you don't need any money for it. Now, because of the challenges of trying to work and get unemployment at the same time, workers often report continuing to job hunt. throughout their time on unemployment. Now, early in the pandemic, workers weren't required to job hunt, but many of them continued to do so. And as a result, they end up being exposed to actually a number of job scams. Individuals who are deliberately targeting unemployed workers at this time to engage them in Western Union scams, to engage them in Insta scams, all types of really just kind of atrocious things. Check cashing scams, kind of like you name it, they've come up with it. We also see that workers seek survival strategies. And those of you who are in Alex's class, this is the book chapter that you read. These survival strategies are efforts that workers have to supplement their incomes with cash. And often cases, these end up being relatively illicit activities. So they're doing drug delivery, they're engaging in sex work. One worker actually ended up having sort of a side business successful side business selling clean pee for other workers' employment drug tests. Now, both these scams and these survival strategies are situations that end up being most commonly mentioned by female respondents in this project. And I have a couple of different reasons for that, I think. One is that, this COVID recession ends up being predominantly female. We see that early on, it's women's work that ends up being slashed. Retail, hospitality, education, childcare. These are all industries that end up being decimated back in March and April of 2020. Women are also typically paid less, which means less by way of reserves and savings. The jobs that did face growth early on, food delivery, for instance, these are jobs that tend to be predominantly male, especially in New York City, where food delivery is often done on e-bike or on scooter. Now, grocery delivery is often seen more as female, but New York City actually already has a history of grocery delivery, very much predates the pandemic. And unlike in more suburban areas, the local Trader Joe's, the Whole Foods, they have their delivery areas all outlined. Everybody knows how to get that stuff delivered. So there's not the same Instacart push that we see in other places. Interviewees who were doing grocery delivery tended to be outside New York City. They were in Newark or right on the suburbs of New York City, or they had cars or they were hauling groceries in so-called granny carts. And that was typically also a lot of heavy lifting. And so those respondents were more likely to be male. So I know I've given you a lot of information. So a couple of sort of key takeaways here. To describe the pandemic, to describe this unemployment assistance as unprecedented has been kind of a truism. And yet never before in American society have the majority of unemployed workers found themselves making more on unemployment than they had been making while working. This was also the first time that gig workers and the self-employed could receive unemployment assistance, although they get it half the level of their employee peers. For these officially unemployed workers, this money could be life-changing. But workers who are engaged in polyemployment remain still vulnerable due to our one job, one worker model of unemployment. So there are some pretty clear-cut solutions here. I have three main recommendations for change. One, we need to mandate the W-2 employee status. I said this in Hustle and Gig. I still stick with this. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We don't need a third way of working. We don't need all these other, we could do this. We have a solution. We have a solution that has literally required generations of hard-won workplace protections. We just need to bring it out to more people. We need to recognize the 1099 status is essentially a way for companies to save themselves some money and outsource risk to the most vulnerable, to the workers. We also need to upgrade our unemployment insurance programs. We need to be better prepared for high need and to account for polyemployment. We had individuals who could only communicate with the unemployment office via fax machine. I don't know about any of you. I don't even know where to find a fax machine anymore. I bet my kids don't know how to work a fax machine. So the idea that this was the way we expect people to communicate when office supply stores are shut was sort of absurd. We also need to, quite frankly, penalize states that have low recipiency rates. Going back to that Social Security pamphlet, if the whole idea of unemployment assistance is to ensure that the risk of unemployment is borne by everyone and not just by the worker, then maybe the states should be doing a little bit more in terms of their safety. And we also need to actively publicize the availability of unemployment assistance. Many of the younger workers that I was interviewing, individuals who were still like 18, 19, into their early 20s, people who were very young during the Great Recession, did not understand what unemployment was. One woman was like, I don't understand. The government's just going to give you money and you don't have to do anything. Like, she was just, I don't understand this, which is, in one sense, oh, great. She's very American. She understands that that's not what the government does. But at the same time, it's a government program that is there to truly help people and to ensure that our economy keeps going. We should have annual benefits like we have for Social Security that tell people, hey, if you were to get fired tomorrow, this is how much you could get. This is how you would apply for it. And this is the next step for you. Oh no, I just lost my thing. Sorry. So in conclusion, the gig-based and precarious workers that are featured in Side Hustle Safety Net end up functioning as canaries in the coal mine. They are highlighting the impact of changes on workers and serving as indicators of potential hazard. They portend a return to a time where unemployment assistance was limited to a select few or entirely non-existent. With low incomes and high levels of workplace risk and insecurity, precarious and gig-based workers can help to highlight some of the implications of these changes that are increasingly affecting workers in more standard and stable employment, such as the impact of gigification and the shifting of risk to workers. The pandemic brought us these daily reminders that we were all in this together in terms of virus exposure and precautions. But we're actually all in this together in terms of the economic impact of workers internalizing risk and turning to polyemployment or side hustles or other survival strategies. By trading the side hustle safety net for increased access to the social safety net of unemployment and other benefits, these unsettled times could lead to a more secure future for everyone. So with that, hopefully I haven't talked too fast, but I would love some questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Before we get to questions, can we have a round of digital applause for our guest tonight? I thought that was absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
And to give you a break from talking, I mean, these two projects to me, they're so fascinating because I mean, really the hustle and gig, I'm assuming all of that research, all the interviews took place immediately before the pandemic. Now you have these sort of two testaments, kind of a snapshot moment in time. Really just like impressive in terms of the scale of the projects, the amount of conversations you had with workers. So I'm really curious to know just kind of like, what conducting all these interviews has told you about just the general psychology of the American worker. I feel like we kicked this seminar off last week with just the students, and we talked a little bit about how, people's feelings about work have changed dramatically over the last couple of years. And I feel like I'm looking at contemporary, labor actions, the Striketober leading into hot labor summer. But I mean, it's more of a vibes assessment, whereas I feel like you and your research team, like, I mean, you've been there, you've talked to the people. So I'm curious to know just kind of like how, to sort of lay these people down on Freud's collective couch. Tell us a little bit about how you think workers are thinking about work. So I think, I mean, that to me is fascinating, just absolutely fascinating. And I think too, the point you make in your conclusion that like, this kind of like creeping precarity, where I think it was easier to think maybe 5 years ago that this is kind of a type of work that a type of person does. And your work reveals just kind of like, how increasingly we're all sort of engaged in this kind of hustle economy. And even jobs. I mean, I have a W-2 job, right? It's like but I see elements of like, that entrepreneurial imperative, right? That kind of like hustle mindset that works its way into even academic employment, which is supposed to be removed from that kind of work. And then I guess the other thing, just thinking about this, the kind of gaslighting I feel like we've all collectively experienced surrounding the pandemic, and just like the return to normal that we're all supposed to snap back to. Says the person who's still talking to a laptop, like way that like, all right, back to work, back to normal. That kind of like collective forgetting, or that organized forgetting that kind of requires, encourages us to forget that, like, you know during the pandemic I had the privilege of sitting in front of this bookcase, which, yes, is organized by color, and teaching from this place. A lot of the students on this call, we're the frontline workers, the heroes who, that hero pay only lasted a month or two. Like, it's, the like people, we simultaneously all experienced this pandemic together, but it was just such an atomizing experience for us all. And I think depending on, all of the intersections of race and class and ethnicity and gender, these radically different pandemic experiences. And now we're just being sort of encouraged to, like, oh, just forget about that, just go back to work, just get back to campus. And it's like, well, I think the pandemic laid a lot of things bare about, like, the type of work that really matters, and the type of workers who, when everybody else was told to stay home, otherwise you might die. There was an entire segment of workers who were like, no, 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 you still have to work. And it's like, what does
Right.
it say about how our society, values, folks in these positions who are often, like, the least compensated too. Um, so I guess, I mean, there's so much to talk about here. And I encourage, the folks in the audience, if you have questions, to add them to the discussion board. But maybe, I don't know, maybe we could start with, as those questions come in, just like, you know, what you think kind of, what your research does to kind of challenge that. I mean, I always call it the cult of entrepreneurship, right? It's like this hustle mindset or grind set, and I think between your two books, Hustle and Gig was revelatory enough, but Side Hustle Safety Net seems to have that added layer of a pandemic on top of it.
Right.
It's like, here are the realities of contemporary labor, like, and they're not pretty.
No, they're not pretty. So, I think the vibe. So, the benefit of getting to interview workers multiple times is that you can really see, like, how those views kind of change over time, right? So early on in the pandemic, everyone's like very worried. We had actually a number of people who were part of this forgotten job list who were not getting unemployment assistance because unemployment was, missing in action for them, right? So, my respondent who's talking about the driving around and seeing the white trucks, he's very worried. In the interviews, one of the things I would ask is like, well, so how would your life be different if you were making $1,100 a week on unemployment right now? And people would be like, wait, what? And I'd be like, yeah, like that's how much the unemployment assistance is. And when you do research, you just put on like your researcher hat. And at the time, I was sort of like, well, I don't know if I should be pointing this out to them, but I feel a little bad if I don't. And also, like, I am curious, like, what would their life be different if they didn't have to go out and do these deliveries? And I will tell you, I was surprised by the number of people we interviewed the second time, and they're like, "Yeah, so you said $1,100," and I was like, "Let me go back to that application and apply and get my unemployment assistance." And our worker, and my apologies, I've given everyone pseudonyms, and sometimes I can't remember the pseudonym. I don't want to give the wrong name. But my individual who, had that entertainment business, and then was doing the food delivery, when he goes back and applies for unemployment assistance, he's like, this is the best thing ever. He is staying at home. He is taking classes on coding. He starts a new business. He's like, oh my gosh, the government's paying for me to, like, plan a new career. This is fantastic. It's my golden ticket. So I think one of the things that has definitely happened is that when people did get that money, it really gave them a chance to take a breather. You know, if you're familiar with Jess Colarusso, she's done a lot about this idea. The US doesn't have a safety net, it has women. And that for a lot of women, care work really increased during the pandemic. But for our respondents, they were hustling so much pre-COVID that it gave them a chance to take a break. And especially if you were a low wage worker, suddenly, even if you're only getting the minimum unemployment assistance, you're getting $800 or so a week, you have the money to pay your rent on time. The money is definitely coming in once it starts coming in, it's stable. And so people actually, even if they had kids and care responsibilities, were like, oh, this is great. I can finally like watch a movie. I don't have to bring my kids places. I don't have to do all these other jobs. Like I got a chance to catch my breath. And I think this is part of why we're going to see, the strikes and the efforts to fight back, because we've seen another way. And also we realize life is short. And those two combinations together, it's like, let's all strike.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right. There's a segment of those workers who actually got to witness the system working, right? Where it's like, oh, this is what I paid in for. But it's, the spectrum of sort of COVID experiences is so vast, and I think you do kind of an amazing job kind of mapping that full terrain. I didn't realize there were that many interviews involved in this entire process. Curious to hear about sort of the next waves, and of course not to ask you about the next project on the first stop of your new book tour, but kind of curious to know what's next for this. But I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't ask about, I wrote this down when you mentioned it and put two big stars next to it, the shadow gig platforms, which sound
Yes.
very ominous.
So So in our sample, we refer to these as like other gig people. And some of them are Craigslist, and we knew what Craigslist was. I'd used it myself. But then we had people mentioning these other things, and we were like, we don't know what this is. We're just gonna like write it down. We'll figure it out later. And it was only when we got to this third round of interviews, which we focus on the low wage W-2 workers and the gig workers, that we started being, wait a second, these companies keep coming up and like, tell me more about this company. Tell me what you're doing. And it turns out that there is a growing movement of B2B, that's business to business gig economy companies. Now, we saw this originally with TaskRabbit. When I was writing Hustle and Gig, they started to create a like TaskRabbit for business, and businesses could reach out to TaskRabbit and they'd hire through the platform, and TaskRabbit would handle like all the payroll and everything for these workers. In some cases, those workers were even W-2 workers because they were temps, and temps are usually W-2. TaskRabbit for business ends up failing. But we see all these new companies created. One of these companies is Roadie. Roadie is 200,000 gig workers across the country, and they're doing last mile deliveries for stores. So if you're getting a delivery from Staples, you're getting a delivery from Home Depot, it's probably coming from a Roadie worker. Roadie is owned by UPS. UPS is the largest Teamster contract in the United States. And so yes, right? Like, oh, that's weird. That's a little concerning. Now, UPS says, oh, well, we won't give any UPS work to Roadie workers, but you can go on like the Twitter for the Roadie workers. You can go and look at screenshots they've done, and it'll be like, deliver this UPS box, blank number of miles. We also see these companies, we're seeing this move into restaurants. So we have the rise of Paired, which was actually created by a chef from Per Se, which is one of the most expensive restaurants in New York City. And Paired markets itself as offering gig work for restaurants. So we already know that restaurant work is incredibly precarious, very dangerous, really kind of rough work. And now you don't even have W-2 protection as you're doing it. Now you're a 1099 worker picking up a shift here and there. We've seen this now also for warehouses, shift gig, gig shift. It's now being used for nurses and nursing assistants. It's also being used for researchers. And so you can now go on uh, Collabtree and hire a US-based PhD for as little as $35 or $40 an hour as a 1099 worker. Sociologists are $40 an hour. But yeah, I mean, and it's coming for all of our jobs. I mean, we can even just think about the student loan forgiveness. They actually had to go in and change the student loan forgiveness guidance because in some states, doctors are hired as 1099 workers for the local hospitals. And they're like, oh, well, you're working for a public hospital, but you're a 1099 worker. You don't get student loan forgiveness anymore. And they actually had to change it so that you now have to send in a letter saying, in my state, I have to be 1099. And then you can qualify for student loan. It's coming for all of us. It's just a matter of time.
Speaking of things that are coming for all of us, you mentioned something in your presentation where you describe these workers as borrowing money from their future selves, and I feel like one of the things, at least in the sample chapter you sent for myself and the students, it just seemed like debt was kind of this looming specter that kind of haunted all of those anecdotes. And thinking of hustle and gig, it was definitely there too. And I'm kind of curious to know, I mean, did you ever sort of pan out and sort of discuss debt with the participants, and and were they aware of kind of debt as sort of like we'd call it like a punitive social technology, but just this kind of this awareness of themselves sort of economically over the long haul? Like, is that something that when you're in sort of a survival situation? And I feel like, thinking of, I mean, we were all in a survival situation because of the pandemic, but not all of us were in an economic survival situation too. Was debt something that you feel like kind of crept into how they thought of themselves and how they related to the world?
Yes, we were surprised by the number of people who actually used their stimulus money and their unemployment assistance to start paying off debt. It was like the world is possibly ending and you're paying off your debt. In some cases, if people owed child support, the money came in and immediately got taken back out by the state. And we also had in New York, they ended alternate side parking. So typically you've got to move your car from one side of the street to the other. They ended most towing, but they kept ticketing. And then at one point they started towing people again. Like they very much decreased the number of towing. But we had multiple people, and most of our respondents didn't own cars. We had multiple respondents have their cars towed due to unpaid parking tickets and having an easy pass that wasn't working when they went through the toll, so unpaid tolls. And they would come out and have their car towed away. One guy was actually living in his car and they kicked him out of the car. And he told the cop, like, I'm living in my car, dude. And he's like, yeah, I don't care. And he towed the car away. And the only way this guy was able to get his car back was by cashing in like the last bit of his unemployment assistance to get his car back. He wasn't the only one. What do we have? At this point, I think it's 4 or 5 people. And this is New York. Like the majority of people in New York don't have cars. And these are low-wage workers. The majority of them really don't have cars. But yeah, they very much got affected by debt during the pandemic and sort of like the long-lasting efforts of it.
Yeah, it's I mean, the example from that chapter, it wasn't the person who was selling their own urine. No, it was the person who resorted to having to go to the bathroom in the car so they could stay in the parking lot
Yes.
hot spot
She's
for.
she's a medical doctor. She's a physical therapist, and that's what she's doing. And she has like no other options
Yeah.
because she's disqualified from the unemployment because she still is working a little bit, but she can't pay her bills.
Well, that's what, yeah, it's the medical school debt, which I mean, is vast. But then part of that story was, well, I have this apartment that I need to pay for and I have this car payment. And then a page and a half later, you're describing how she's then going to the bathroom in this car, and it just occurred to me, I'm like, this is the car that she's paying off that she's also using as a it's just, like the way that debt sort of like, just diminishes us as humans. I feel like is
Yes.
just comes out of these stories. I mean, it's right there to be seen. And we got a couple
You
questions
have a lot of questions.
here. Let me see if we can kind of move through them. I saw
Should
one.
I stop screen sharing? Would that be better?
Oh yeah, actually that'll probably make my window a little bigger. Nice. Oh, question about whether is there any truth to the rumor about whether or not having unemployment on your record could negatively impact you moving forward? Is there anything to that? I've heard that before.
Yes. So if a worker has a gap in their resume, that often comes up when they're applying for a new job. We know that if a worker is unemployed, the first 6 months, it's very important to get a new job. If you're unemployed for more than 6 months, you become what's known as part of the long-term unemployed. It becomes much harder to get a job. In fact, at one point during the Great Recession, employers were actually saying they wouldn't hire anyone who was unemployed. They only wanted to hire people who currently had jobs. So it becomes very difficult. Also, in the US, typically 6 months is the most you're going to get for unemployment assistance. So at that 6 month mark, your unemployment ends, you don't have a new job, and it becomes much, much harder to sort of move forward. Sarah Damask has a great book that came out last year that looks at sort of different strategies towards unemployment that workers do based on race and sex, actually, or income and sex.
Interesting. That's there's another question here about freelancing, and I was curious. I guess it sort of ends with this idea, that freelancing has been a problem for a long time, and I feel like organizing around freelancing, like this is something that's been in its very nascent stages. It feels like forever, and I guess within a seminar series like this that's about American labor, and we do tend to lean toward the benefits of organizing and unionizing. Can you tell us the stories of attempts to actually? I mean, these individual workers, like it's so challenging because they work in such isolated environments. Are there attempts to organize?
So some of our creative freelancers were involved because they were involved in performance. They were involved with like SAG-AFTRA. They were involved with like the performing unions. And so some of them tried to get benefits, but they couldn't necessarily get like enough credits to qualify for the like the health insurance benefits. Apparently it's very difficult to do, or it was very hard for them to get into the union. In terms of other organizing so I see from your post you were in New York for 10 years. We still have the freelancers union. Their health insurance has gotten so expensive that a lot of freelancers can't afford it. And so their response was to open up a medical clinic where people could go and like get some of like the basics taken care of. There has been an effort in New York, it's called Freelancing's Not Free, to ensure that freelancers are getting paid when they're supposed to be paid, and sort of work on like ensuring that there are clear contracts and that there are penalties to employers that don't pay on time. But otherwise, I think it's been difficult for people to come together, and I think a lot of the attention has sort of moved from freelance into gig and the efforts to organize platform-based gig workers.
Nice. And I feel like a lot of that, I know at least in California, was about just kind of classifying them as workers as opposed to independent contractors, right? That was
Yeah,
sort of
we don't have AB5 in New York. There has been talk about doing something like that, but so far they're still paid as 1099. Yeah.
Gotcha. We had another question on the board that kind of looks back at the Great Depression and councils of the unemployed. These were organized by the Communist Party. We actually talk about this in my labor studies class. The guest here says, put considerable pressure on both federal, state, and local governments to step in to provide aid. Um, are you aware of any similar organizing campaigns that took place during the pandemic beyond mutual? And actually, we had questions submitted ahead of time about mutual aid programs, and I was curious to know, whether any of the participants in the study had sort of engaged in that kind of mutual aid too.
Yeah, so some of the creative freelancers and sort of the workers who were officially unemployed and were more financially stable as a result, they actually did become active in mutual aid. So they would talk about like doing food deliveries, working in food banks, which I know is a little bit different. There were a number of refrigerators set up throughout New York City, like the food pantry refrigerators. And so they would go and actually like put food in those. And a couple of workers actually talked about getting sort of like organized in their neighborhoods to do things like bring food to people who couldn't leave their homes. There was some of that. On the other hand, we also had one woman who was an immigrant. She couldn't get unemployment assistance, or she believed she couldn't. And she and her husband were undocumented, so that made it even more complicated. But she was able to get some mutual aid food delivered to her house on a weekly basis, which really made a big difference from her. There was also a bit of so both the Jewish and Muslim communities in New York also sort of created their own kind of mutual aids. And so people talked about sort of taking advantage of both. And they'd be like, oh, well, it's great. I'm going to get kosher food from here. I'm going to get halal food from there. And like, it'll all work out. So there was a little bit of that. Yeah. I mean, New Yorkers, I feel like really did come together. And I'm sure people in other places did too, but it very much felt like people were kind of looking out for each other in a way that I didn't necessarily hear from people in other places.
Nice. I did not know that they'd suspended alternate side of the parking rules. That's huge. And I see somebody on the board. I as a former New York City resident myself, it also cost me thousands of dollars while I lived there. Um, that's we've got there's a question about sort of generational differences. This is an interesting one. So with the eruption of social media like TikTok and short form videos, hustle and grindset culture seems very pervasive today, especially among young Gen Z workers. So in your interviews, did you notice the culture being a prominent barrier for young gig workers and understanding their rights, benefits, and relative precarity and exploitation?
Ooh, that's a good one. So I think a lot of the workers understood that they were definitely exploited and very precarious. They were very clear on that, right? Especially those that were like in their early 20s. In terms of understanding their rights, you know, given the number of people who didn't know what unemployment assistance was and didn't know how to qualify and didn't know like that there were ways that they could appeal. So for instance, in the opening bit, yeah, it's like Abdul probably could have gotten unemployment assistance, right? If Andrew was able to get it with 1 week of work, then Abdul should have been able to get it. Some workers talked about figuring out ways. There was one young man, he was like 28 years old. He actually had been working as a 1099 worker and then had gotten a new job. And he hadn't been at the new job long enough to qualify for unemployment. So he ended up going back and being like, well, then put me in under the 1099 stuff and give me the CARES Act unemployment. And so in some cases, I think that the younger generation, if they knew that they didn't know, they were turning to TikTok, they were turning to Reddit, especially, and finding out how to like work their way through the system. But if they didn't know that they didn't know it, then they were just kind of like, well, I guess I don't get unemployment, or I don't know what unemployment is, or I guess I'm just going to go and like do food delivery because I mean, quite frankly, for the last 12 years, more than 12 years, we've had platforms like Uber and TaskRabbit and DoorDash market themselves as a solution to unemployment, right? They market themselves as like, oh, you're not making any money, do this, make your own schedule, make your own work. And so I think for a lot of people, that's what they heard is the safety net. That's why we call it the side hustle safety net, because these platforms marketed it that way. And actually, research shows that fewer will apply for unemployment assistance if there is an active Uber presence in their community. That they're like, oh, I don't have a job. I guess I go do Uber.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting and kind of sad. I mean, these are safety nets that are constructed out of our own contributions. I mean, it's not. But I always think like even thinking of it as a safety net, in some way obscures the fact that it's one that we collectively weave together, right? I mean, it's there to catch us in those times of need, but it's also something that that you pay into, like over every time you get a paycheck and there's a little something taken out, like that's what that goes toward. Yeah, and it's interesting, during your presentation talking about the group of workers who just refuse to even consider taking unemployment, and that kind of just like that mindset. It's interesting to me. I can't think of these two books now as not sort of part one and part two, and kind of like extend the stories that occur. And so obviously recommend Hustle and Gig, which I have in front of me.
Oh,
Yeah, for people in the audience, if you haven't checked it out, it's great. But it's just, telling the story of this turn. And I think it's, I, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say we're going to be sort of studying the last 4 or 5 years, probably for the rest of our lives, right? They're going to be, I mean, for all the reasons, but, and I think there's a sense sometimes, as somebody who works sort of in contemporary history and contemporary literature, your proximity to something can kind of obscure your ability to sort of make much sense of it. And I just think, for me, these are two of the most sort of clarifying books on contemporary labor and just kind of the psyche of the contemporary worker that I've come across. And I'm just super appreciative that you zoomed in to join us tonight and to launch this book, which I think is going to be a great success.
thank you. Well, I hope so. You're talking about it as like book one and book two. I'm actually writing book three right now, which will be based on. So the idea is to look at what happens to all these workers as the unemployment assistance ends, and what happens to them is next. So are they able to keep those businesses going? If they turn to gig work during the pandemic, what does that mean for them? Like if you turn to gig work, do you end up even worse off? And so, yeah, we are in the early stages of writing, but hopefully next year.
Nice. Well, then what? Probably 2 years from now, we can have you back.
Great. I'll be working on book four.
Yeah. Well, this has been fantastic, and what a great way to start the seminar series this quarter. I really appreciate it, and yeah, I guess if we have students or attendees who have other questions, do you mind if they reach out?
Please. Yeah, no, definitely. Please do. I'm on Twitter. I think my DMs are open. But I think I also posted my email at the beginning. But Alex, you can feel free to share it. I will say I'm not always perfect in email, so feel free to send it twice. Oh, well, okay. Yes, you're more moderate. Oh, as old people, our brains get tired, and we don't really like Elon anyway. So yeah, Twitter, X sounds dirty.
Yeah, not a huge fan of that.
No.
But yeah, so yeah, I mean, I just again just super appreciative of the generosity of the time, and yeah, this is great.